Sure you will bear with me the difficulty we have in times of COVID. This presentation will primarily be in English as much as possible, reason being we are going to have global audience. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which I work and live and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, before we proceed further, we need to have some housekeeping. Please keep your camera on at all times, unless there are issues that you need to address. Should you interact with the speaker, please introduce yourself, your name, your profession, and your interest if possible. Generally, the microphone would be muted just because we need to eliminate the sounds in our environment and have a better sound quality. Interimly, we are going to have online polls, and from time to time, I will brief you as to what the polls are all about. Today's topic, as we are all aware of, China, systemic transitional fluidity, and South Asia. The speaker today, as we all know, Mahmud Ali had his initial training in Cadet College, Janada Cadet College to be specific, and he launched his career in the military service. Subsequently, he joined 2 newspapers and edited them. He landed in England and furthered his geo-military strategic vision while a student. Mahmud joined the BBC in 1997 for a 23-year career. Sorry, he joined earlier, but for a 23-year career. In 1997, he became the first Bengali to be appointed as the head of Bangla Services. He retired in 2009 as a senior editorial co-editor, Asia Pacific. His career spans over a period of time. Since I and my fellow friends who are here now, we all know his aptitude of delivering, communicating in English, which has been time and again recognized by far and wide. His most illustrious accomplishment was in December 1990, having worked in King's College London on the theme Nation Building and Nature of Conflict in South Asia, a search for patterns in the use of forces as political instrument within and between the states of the region. Mahmud defended his thesis very successfully, which was recognized by M.E. Sharp in New York and Z Books London published a selection of his case studies from his dissertation as The Fearful State Power. Mahmud brings with him enormous research richness of South Asia and in particular China. He is currently an adjunct professor and has numerous publications to his credit. Today, he is recognized as an international resource personnel in the field of international relations relating to Southeast Asia and, like I said, China in particular. I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, today's discussion will be a lively one. I expect and we hope that we will interact, and we have a lot to ask him and ask ourselves, and in the process, we will be testing our good friend Mahmud with all our silly and odd questions. But at the end of the day, nothing is silly and nothing is odd. I now would like and request Mahmud to please take the stage, center stage, and address his presentation. A minute, I need to unmute him. Bear with me, please.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your very kind words of introduction. I'm most grateful for that. Assalamu alaikum and warm greetings to everyone. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. I'm particularly indebted to Imdad for initiating this event and scheduling folks on 4 continents to spend Saturday online. I'm honored to meet my old friends and hopefully make some new ones today. It's a privilege to share some thoughts on a theme that's occupied me for more than 30 years. Do feel free to challenge absolutely everything I say. Looking at how China has changed, how that change impacted on Sino-US insecurity
Mahmud,
dynamics.
may I stop you for a sec? You're breaking up, so you might want to adjust your microphone, please.
I just hope that you can hear me now. Does that sound normal?
It sounds normal now. Yes, please.
Okay. I think I will slow down the pace a little because that might help. So as I was saying, we're looking at how China has changed, how that change impacted on Sino-US insecurity dynamics, and also how that has affected South Asia, particularly Bangladesh. The 3 elements of my presentation are US-China tensions described as a new Cold War, the systems model of geopolitical and strategic studies, which explains this dramatic development, and finally, how this impacts on South Asia, particularly Bangladesh. US leaders, as you know, openly identified China as the principal rival in December 2017.
Mahmud, please slow down. Slow down.
American leaders openly identified China as their principal rival in their December 2017 National Security Strategy Report. A stream of policy papers and official statements built up the launch of a new Cold War, although it was not described as such. But a new Cold War because it includes an all-of-government effort on trade, technology, intelligence operations, military pressure, cyber security, investment, academic research, and political incitement against China's ruling Communist Party. Over the past 2 months, 5 senior US officials issued around 10 statements on the existential threat China allegedly poses to US global leadership or systemic primacy and Western liberal international order defended with US power. I'll provide a few examples. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, 21st July. The Chinese Communist Party continues to engage in systematic rule breaking, coercion, and other malign activities. And most concerning to me, the People's Liberation Army continues its aggressive behavior in the East and South China Seas. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, 17th July. China seeks to remake the world in its autocratic image and subordinate other nations in its hegemonic ambitions. General William Barr, 16th July. China is now engaged in an economic blitzkrieg, an aggressive, orchestrated, whole-of-government, indeed whole-of-society campaign to seize the commanding heights of the global economy and to surpass the United States as the world's preeminent superpower. Director Christopher Wray, 7th July. The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. It's a threat to our economic security and by extension, our national security. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, 24th June, and that's the last one. We are the strongest nation on earth, and we will not bend to the Chinese Communist Party. Together with our allies and partners, we will resist the CCP's efforts to manipulate our people and our governments, damage our economies, and undermine our sovereignty. The days of American passivity and naivety regarding the People's Republic of China are over, unquote. These remarks reflected the US defense strategy issued in June this year, assigning the US Space Command and Space Force to battle China in outer space. Other US forces have already drawn up plans and are preparing for combat. I study US-China relations from a European, as distinct from a US social scientific research perspective. The European Socratic empirical rational tradition is founded on a skeptical quest for evidentiary ascertainment of linearity and causal connections between phenomena and categories, or seeking the truth from facts. In contrast, the US tradition is focused on shaping policy and is thus value-laden, judgmental, and prescriptive. Nothing right or wrong there, just different models. Imagine a crime scene with helicopters overhead. The police chopper is a party to the event, observing suspects and guiding the cops on the ground. Their purpose is to fight crime. That is the American model. The news chopper is equally keenly engaged, observing and reporting what's happening for their viewers. They're not taking sides, just seeking the truth from facts. That's the European model, the academic framework of my remarks. Systems formulation, an analytical model, was devised to address a complex reality comprising varied and dynamic temporal spatial interactions among many variables, and designed to make it more comprehensible. The national security system comprises the sum total of all relational dynamics among states and governments. Imagine a series of concentric circles. The outermost circle defines the perimeters encompassing relations among all states. Central circle in the middle is the core comprising the most powerful states, the superpowers. Inside the core lies the dominant system consisting of great powers, states with far greater power than needed for self-defense. The rest of the world is divided into subordinate systems like Southern Asia or South America or Africa. These are subdivided into regional subsystems like South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. Now, what's power? Power here represents an actor's capacity to defend its interests, effect desired changes, and prevent negative shifts in the environment. Visualize the UN General Assembly in September. Heads of government, foreign ministers, permanent representatives, and delegates meeting and mingling, shaking hands, chatting politely, and networking. This is an image of the international system. Here, every state with one vote is equal. The General Assembly, however, has limited power. Power resides in the Security Council. Its 5 permanent members with veto power represent the core and the dominant system. The elected members without the veto enjoy transient power. Other states have modest influence. Alliances and strategic partnerships linking the core and peripheral states are called intrusive systems, transmitting tensions in both directions. Systemic core defines the system structure. The Cold War core was bipolar, with the 2 superpowers, the USA and the USSR, competing for system-wide influence. To add leverage over Moscow, Washington built a tacit alliance with Beijing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the core suddenly became unipolar, with the USA the sole superpower. Transitions inject fluidity, anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. The USA is determined to perpetuate its primacy, and China is determined to sustain socialism. Between 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and China began building islands in the South China Sea. The unipolar core allowed the USA to enforce its will. Suddenly, in 2014, the core and the system became bipolar or even tripolar. China decisively moved into the core, and the USA now perceives two rivals. This polarity transition triggered systemic fluidity. US aligned states have deepened their alliances, but others will struggle to defend their agency and interest. Joining the UN in 1971, China moved from the periphery to the core in a few short decades to be identified by the established primate, the USA, as its principal rival. US-China relations now define the systemic core and will shape the system in the coming decades, possibly throughout the century. The challenge is to reconcile forces determined to maintain the status quo, that is, US systemic primacy and the US-led order, and revisionist tendencies manifest in China's growing power and Russia's assertiveness. Whereas US power, supported by allies and with military bases, sustains its global presence, China's rapidly growing power is concentrated around its own East Asian region. Since China, unlike European states, India, Japan, Australia, and so on, refused to submit itself to US leadership, the USA identified China as its preeminent rival as early as in July 1999. But China had already identified the USA as its main threat in October 1993, thereby establishing competitive mutual insecurity. What we now see is overt animus posing potentially catastrophic escalatory risks for everyone. What explains current xenophobia? Unprecedented scale and speed of power growth and fundamental divergences. Professor Karen Skinner, director of the policy planning staff at US State Department, said on the 29th of April last year, "This is a fight with a really different civilization and a different ideology, and the United States hasn't had that before. The Soviet Union and that competition, in a way, it was a fight within the Western family. First time that we will have a great power competitor that is not Caucasian. We see it as a more fundamental long-term threat. In China, we have an economic competitor, we have an ideological competitor, one that really does seek a global reach that many of us didn't expect a couple of decades ago." Skinner ignored Japan's role in the 1930s and 1940s, but she showed us how US policymakers view China today. Deeply troubled by the state of US-China relations on the 40th anniversary of diplomatic relations established by his administration, former President Carter expressed grave concern to President Trump last year. Trump explained his worries about how China is getting ahead of us in every way. This is Carter speaking. Carter later said, Trump was worried about China leapfrogging the USA as an economic superpower. Carter said, "I don't really fear that time, but it bothers President Trump. I don't know why." Since December 1978, Xiaoping's reforms boosted China's full modernizations in agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military strength. Economic production, or GDP, is a metric of measure. Between 1979 and 2018, China's real GDP grew at 9.5% annually, with the GDP doubling every 8 years. In 1979, GDP was $178.28 billion nominally dollars. In 1990, GDP nominal was $1.115 trillion. And in purchasing power parity terms, it was $1.616 trillion. Last year, China's GDP was $14.34 or $34 trillion nominally, and in PPP terms, $22.527 trillion, almost equivalent to the state's GDP. China's rise as a manufacturing, exporting, and importing country was astounding. From Western and Japanese-owned fabrication mostly around Shanghai in 1949, China became the factory of the world, starting with assembly and light manufacturing, then heavy industry and value-added manufacturing. 1978, China's goods trade rose from $29.34 billion, or less than 1% of the world's total, at an average annual rate of 14%, to $4.62 trillion, or 11.77% of the world total in 2018. Foreign direct investment funded exports boosted employment, technology transfer, research and development, upskilling, innovation, and value addition. FDI-funded exports were 58.3% of the total export in 2005. It fell to 41.7% in 2018. Composition of exports and imports changed with rising level of China's scientific and technological value addition. China is the top trading partner of many countries and is still the hub of global supply chains. US decoupling, labor shortages, and wage rise will change this, but China's weight in world trade will likely persist for many, many years. China's independence explains its deep anxiety over its Malacca dilemma, which I can talk about later on. The 2004 US Global Posture Review, which reinforced American forces around China, and Hu Jintao's new military missions for the new era it dictated to the PLA at that time. The defense of China's freedom of maritime action confronting US allied threats, particularly around Malacca, triggered PLA, or People's Liberation Army, naval modernization, expansion, reforms, base building, and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. China's rapid rise in science and technology transformed its economy and its military power. That brings me to China's defense budget. China's defense budget in 2000 was $14.6 billion. In 2009, it was $70.27 billion. In 2016, it was $146.7 billion. And last year, it was $177.6 billion. These are, of course, Chinese figures, and skeptics insist actual PLA budgets are much higher, but still very much lower than the US military budget of over $700 billion a year. China's tacit challenge to US systemic primacy or unipolarity triggered what I call displacement anxiety. In 2015-2016, senior American officials, academics, and think tanks became very critical of China's what they described as assertiveness. I could outline how US-Chinese tensions evolved since 1992, but I think we should look at South Asia now. South Asian regional subsystem is simultaneously centripetal and centrifugal. Politics, economics, history, geography, ethnography, and demography make it Indo-centric. India's South Asian neighbors share borders with India, but not with each other. Relations range from those with Bhutan, relations between India and its neighbors, those from Bhutan, a protectorate with no foreign policy or military agency, to relations with Pakistan, which is a nuclear armed adversary, and everything in between. Bangladesh balances itself in the dynamic middle. South Asia was part of the wartime allied China-India-Burma theater, with command divided between Britain and the USA. For Britain, India itself was a theater. For the USA, India was a logistical base. By India, I mean South Asia. After the war, the USA took the lead in counter-communist campaigns. On 5th July 1947, weeks before independence, Jawaharlal Nehru, then member of the Viceroy's Executive Council for External Affairs, authorized the United States Air Force and the CIA to utilize 6 Indian air bases for refueling, rearming, repairing, servicing, and maintaining US aircraft deployed on combat missions against Chinese Red Army in southern China. This agreement was revised and renewed 4 times until 1962. After China reoccupied Tibet in late 1950, Nehru authorized the Intelligence Bureau to mount a covert proxy war supporting Khampa, Amdoa, and Golok guerrillas against the Chinese forces. The USA was deeply interested. CIA and the Kuomintang, or nationalist Chinese, provided limited support to the guerrillas. After the USA signed pacts with Pakistan India signed the 1954 Partial Treaty with Beijing, acknowledging Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. But the Intelligence Bureau and the CIA boosted covert operation against the PLA in Tibet. In 1959, the guerrillas nearly captured Lhasa, but the PLA defeated US-Indian proxies. The Dalai Lama fled to India under CIA armed protection. So India has been in the pro-US anti-China camp since 1947. Pakistan, fearful of India, signed treaties with the USA, but in 1962, under intense US pressure to work with India against China, Pakistan moved towards China in externally balancing India. The systems model suggests actors balance perceived threats by both internally boosting integral capacity or internal balancing and externally seeking foreign protection or external balancing. The Soviet Union and China allied against the USA. Later, the USA and China allied against the Soviet Union. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Nepal fought Chinese leverage against India. Bangladesh, existing within an India-China-USA strategic triangle, exemplifies another paradigm. Bangladesh rose along a trajectory of warming relations with China since 1976. Beginning with military help, Chinese aid expanded to economic, commercial, and diplomatic realms. Xi Jinping's 2016 pledges of $24 billion in aid and investment, rising to a cumulative $30 billion, compared to India's $10 billion in aid. China's dispatch of COVID-19 specialists and exemption of tariffs on 97% of Bangladeshi exports were seen as strategically motivated. All Bangladeshi governments, Awami League, BNP, military, bureaucratic, have expanded and deepened relations with China. In 2010, Prime Minister Hasina sought Beijing's help with building a deep-sea port in Chittagong. China agreed and surveyed the Shonadia site. Indian, US, and Japanese pressure Dhaka to rescind that plan and accept the Japanese-funded Matarbadi project instead. Contracted Chinese firms to build parts of the Para deep-sea port in southwestern Bangladesh, but the episode showed limits of Bangladesh's independence of action in even areas of its own national interest. At the height of the pandemic, urged Beijing to fund 9 infrastructure projects worth $6.4 billion. Some results may have come through by now, especially the Tista project. China particularly figures in the strategic security arena. Bangladeshi forces procured roughly 50% of their hardware from China since 1977, when President Ziaur Rahman first visited. But when in 2009, Bangladesh launched Forces Goal 2030, a modernization plan, Bangladesh-India tensions became apparent, notably after 2011, when Prime Minister Hasina revealed, last year, during my visit to China, I requested the Chinese government to present frigates with helicopters to the Bangladesh Navy. The government of China agreed. In 2013, she said, a friendly country would provide 2 submarines to the Bangladesh Navy. In response, India presented an upgraded Russian-built Kilo-class submarine to the Myanmar Navy, with which the Bangladesh Navy was competing in the Bay of Bengal. When news broke that Bangladesh Navy would receive 2 refurbished Min-class submarines from China, Bangladesh Navy Chief Admiral Nizam Ahmed explained Bangladesh's defensive approach to naval modernization. Like other regional forces, the Bangladesh Navy will evolve into a true 3-dimensional force with acquisition of the 2 submarines from China, he said. India objected. Former Navy Chief and respected strategist Admiral Arun Prakash said, given Bangladesh's economic situation and the fact that it is surrounded on 3 sides by India, the acquisition of the submarines is not only illogical, but actually an act of provocation as India is concerned. Obviously, this transfer is a step further in China's strategy of encircling India with its client states. Commanding Kolkata Naval Base said, why would Bangladesh need submarines? This decision by the government there is a matter of concern for us. We also suspect that Chinese submarines are sneaking into Indian territorial waters in the Bay of Bengal region, though none has been detected as yet, unquote. The Min is a 1950s model with modest abilities. It only fires torpedoes, but Bangladesh's acquisition of it seemed unacceptable to its closest neighbor. Bangladesh-China ties triggered Indian responses. 6 months after Xi Jinping's Dhaka visit, during Bangladesh Prime Minister's April 27 trip to India, Delhi proposed a defense agreement, which Prime Minister Hasina politely declined. During her visit in July 2018, India secured an agreement on military training cooperation, extending $500 million credit to buy Indian military hardware for Bangladesh forces. During the Prime Minister's visit in October last year, India secured an agreement to design, build, and jointly operate a coastal surveillance radar network along Bangladesh's coastline to monitor ship movements in the Bay of Bengal, and thereby establish a potentially permanent security presence in Bangladesh, presumably to counterbalance Chinese influence. I think I'll stop here. Thanks very much indeed, Imdad. I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me, Mahmud? Okay. I guess it was very enlightening, to be honest. And in the process, we learned few things that we not normally get to see here and there in the newspapers or wherever we come across. Now, as Mahmud has presented, this house is open to challenge him. And if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and you can ask him directly. In order to ask him directly, I would request you to please state your name, where you are, and your interest in China, whatever subjects you are in, be it a profession or whatever it is. So this house is now open to Mahmud for challenges. Anybody, please, you're welcome.
Mahmud Bhai, this is Mahmud Hassan from Dallas, Texas, 8 Intake Powerhouse, cadet number 406.
Okay.
My profession is aerospace and defense. I do software architecture. And I have before I ask you the question, I must tell you that your presentation was excellent. And you have touched most of the information that I had in my mind. I have a very straight-cut question that when during 1970 and 71, when Nixon administration decided that they will open up with China and did a covert diplomacy through Pakistan, and his foreign secretary, Henry Kissinger, went and did a lot of diplomacy. My question is, did they know that they are waking up a sleeping giant? And did they have any plan to handle that if that happens?
Well, thanks very much. Very interesting question. I say very interesting because I've been studying China-US relations for a number of years, and I've written a couple of books on the subject. And exactly on this subject is the second volume in my series, and that looks at the exchanges between not just Kissinger, but other US officials and Chinese officials at the time. What they were looking to do was to end the war in Vietnam, primarily. This was President Nixon's initiative. He was determined. There were two reasons, really. The first one was, of course, a domestic reason. It was essential for the Nixon administration, inheriting the war from the Johnson administration, that Nixon had determined it was important for the USA to bring the boys home and bring the boys home with honor. And they recognized that the war could not be ended without neutralizing Soviet support for the North Vietnamese. And to counteract the Soviet support for North Vietnamese, they needed to develop leverage. And although they were not aware of the fact that right then, in 1969-70, the Chinese leadership was also seeking ways of establishing contacts with the United States, because the Soviet Union had attacked China in two areas, one in the what we call the Ussuri River or the Amur River, and in Xinjiang. And these are very serious threats. And so unbeknownst to each other, Nixon did not know what the Chinese were doing, and Mao did not know what Nixon was doing. They were both of them exploring their geopolitical circumstances. And both sides, quite interestingly, determined independently that the far enemy for China was the United States, was much less dangerous than the near enemy. For China, the near enemy was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was actually determined to destroy China's nuclear weapon state. And they were preparing for this. They sought the Nixon administration's say-so, whether the Nixon administration would tolerate a surgical strike by Soviet forces on Chinese nuclear weapon sites. This was a very dangerous situation. The Chinese did not know about this, but the Americans knew this. And this is a time when coinciding interests, that is, against the Soviet Union, both sides decided that they needed to build some sort of clandestine bridges. And they were already talking in Warsaw. Ambassadorial meetings were taking place every month or every 6 weeks in Warsaw. These talks did not get very far, but Nixon instructed Kissinger to communicate with the Chinese. So first Kissinger tried via the French. This failed. Then next he went to the Romanians, the Poles, and a couple of other countries that I can't remember. Eventually, the Chinese responded when the messages were taken by the Pakistani head of government, then President Yahya Khan. It was only then that the Chinese were convinced that the Americans were sincere in trying to make contact with China, because US-China relations had been really bad to the extent that both sides were preparing for war. So at that time, Pakistan served as a conduit for geopolitical purposes, serving both US and Chinese interests. Both China and the United States saw this as their responsibility to protect Pakistan. Insofar as what was happening in then East Pakistan and Bangladesh, their primary concern was that internal political processes must be managed domestically. If third-party intervention was permitted, if a bigger country could get into a smaller country for its own interest, then there would be chaos in the system. And this was their primary driver behind attempting to insulate Pakistan from any Indian intervention. Now, of course, Americans have done much more than any other country in supporting Bangladesh. As soon as it became independent, as soon as Bangladeshi refugees started traveling to India, seeking shelter there, the Democratic Party, particularly under Senator Kennedy and others, made sure they passed legislation in Congress to authorize funding, substantial funding, for providing food, medicine, shelter, and basic necessities for the Bangladeshi refugees in Indian refugee camps. But in terms of state policy, Nixon's administration was determined to counteract Soviet threat. And to that end, China became a very, very important instrument of leverage for them. I don't know if this answers your question, but this is all I know.
No, I guess my question was that you are fighting like one evil with the other, and in doing so, did they take any precaution or any safeguards to contain China should they become even bigger than Russia? Because they had all intellectuals thinking about like opening up and how China has a potential in future. I think they knew all that. What kind of precautions they have taken or failed to take at the time, or they probably had some other plans that did not materialize because of the administration changes and all. So I was just thinking, like, it's naive to think that they did not think that eventually China will become a superpower.
Mahmud bhai, this is Dr. Feroz, fourth intake from Fort Myers, Feroz. I have a question for you. With the United States and China on a collision course, but the future, the United States cannot live without China, and China cannot do without the United States. Where do you see the future heading?
Well, if you recall, the top of the presentation was a series of quotations by US officials, cabinet level officials, and so on, 5 of them. The 10 statements are just not people speaking. These people are the core of the government of the United States. They represent the executive branch. And it is not just the executive branch that is sort of anti-China now. If you look at Congress, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the senior most Democrat,
We lost you.
Your voice.
We lost your voice.
and this was automatic. Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been a leader in the congressional attempt to enact laws to punish China on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, on South China Sea, on financial matters. So there is a bipartisan consensus within the US establishment, not just the executive branch, but in Congress and legislature as well, and in the judiciary. If you look at the number of trials that currently are being pursued by the Department of Justice, I'm told, this is the Department of Justice, so Attorney General, saying something like there are 10 new cases on Chinese espionage every week. So that's really a lot of cases. He could be exaggerating, but the fact is there is an all of society push across the United States against China. So whether you or I believe that the USA cannot live without China or China cannot live without USA, the current political atmosphere in the USA is definitely very powerfully anti-Chinese. Opinion polls conducted over the last 3 months demonstrate that very, very powerful bodies of opinion, from 47% to 53% to 70% now, that's the rise of public opinion is anti-Chinese in the USA. So for the moment, at least, even if President Trump loses re-election on 3rd November and President Biden takes over in January next, even then, the US pressure against China will remain significant for some time. That's my reading.
Mahmud bhai,
Thank
I
you.
have a
Thank you.
question.
Can I hold the horse, please? Just a moment. Give me a moment, please. Abhijit, just give me a moment, okay?
Okay, no problem.
Give me a moment, because I need to, what we have now, gentlemen, we have live polls. So I will throw up the questions. You have 10 seconds to answer. Please answer them as truthfully as you can.
Answer where?
You will get the poll. You'll have, on the count of 10, I'm going to pull it back. So here it goes. 1, 2, 3. You can see, you can see for yourself. Please say yes or no. Anybody else answering? I can see a lot of people haven't answered. Whatever. There are only 28 answers.
That's a very extreme question.
That's the whole purpose. Where are the rest? There are still at least a couple of people that haven't answered.
How do you
Anyway,
define
thank
the
you.
war?
So
Yeah, this is a trouble thing. How do you define war? Anyway, you're expected to be extremists. So
we've got a poll. I can see. Can you see the results?
Yeah, we can see the result.
Yep,
Lovely.
I can.
At least we have the polls.
18-0.
Abhijit, I'll leave it to you, please. You can ask your question now.
Thank you, Mahmud Bhai, for the wonderful deliberations. And as you know, the contours of global politics have been changing so fast, especially after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Now comes the Sino-American Cold War, as you mentioned. My question is about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So sometimes I think that this initiative could create a debt trap. As a case in point, I can cite the example of Sri Lanka during the regime of Rajapaksa. They signed a deal with China to build that port in, Hambantota Port. Okay, it was built with a sum of around $5.5 billion. And eventually, Sri Lanka couldn't pay it back. So now, China has taken the ownership of this Hambantota port for the next 99 years. So now this Belt and Road Initiative is creating a clash between the dragon and the elephant. So the elephant thinks if that road, the former Silk Road, touching Near East, Central Asia, Europe, South Asia, and bifurcating Pakistan, it will reach the port of Gwadar in Balochistan, which is a deep water port. And it is of very, very strategic importance. So if Pakistan, whose economy is faltering, and if it is again under huge debt, it will again approach the IMF to resuscitate its economy. So if the fate of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka and the port in Gwadar have the same fate, what will happen? And the flexing of muscles of China all over the world now, the recent clash with India, then the contention over the Spratly Islands in the South Pacific, which like Vietnam, the Philippines, and many other countries claim. So these are the issues which are of global concern, So the Belt and Road Initiative, while it could create a lot of jobs and other things, but it could also create conflict. So what is your opinion about this?
Mahmud, before you attempt to answer this question, if I may add, would you consider the Belt and Road Initiative? It resonates with the Marshall Plan after Second World War. While you're answering, or rather trying to respond to Abhijit, if you can address this statement as well.
This particular question about the Belt and Road is especially topical for me because I want to, with the chair's permission, I want to show something.
Sure.
It's called empirical evidence. Can you see this?
Raise a little bit. Raise a little bit. Raise now. Yeah, go to piche no. Towards you. Take it towards you. Lift it up a little bit. Lift it up. Yes. More up, please.
Then as Belt and Road Vision.
Yeah.
It's good.
This is my book number 7 on the U.S.-China relations series. I show this because I've spent the last 3 years working on the Belt and Road Initiative, and I went back sort of when the discussions began on this subject. And I discovered that there are different bits of history that have been pulled together. And Xi Jinping has very little to do with this, really. So let's talk about where the ideas came from. There are different sources. There are American sources, and there are Soviet sources and there are multilateral sources. I wonder if you're familiar or if you recall this, the Trans-Asian Highway Network or Asian Railway Network. These are SCAP, UN SCAP projects. They were established decades ago. And the idea of the United Nations Agency for Economic and Social and Cultural Development for the Asia Pacific, UN SCAP, the idea was to build communication for ease of movement of people and goods across Asia, linking it with Europe. There were supposed to be two networks, one the northern one, which went across what is called Eurasia. So you start with China, Eastern China, go across China, then Central Asia or the Soviet Union, and go into Eastern Europe and then into Western Europe. This is the northern route. The southern route would come down from China via Thailand, Myanmar, what was then East Pakistan, India, then West Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and again into Europe. These networks were just visions by UNSCAP, UNCTAD, UNDP, and eventually the World Bank took this over or provided an umbrella for looking at this. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, the push came from one particular American politician who passed away last year. He went to jail. He ran for president a number of times as an independent. His name appears here. He was considered an outlandish person in the USA and was marginal. When he died, all the major newspapers ran his obituary, but they treated him as someone slightly, off it, not very sort of thinking straight. But in Europe, he was very famous. In the 1980s, he began talking about communication hubs, and he started visualizing a united Eurasia, railway, super speed, fast railway networks that would link entire Europe and eventually East Asia, China. And when the UNDP began organizing conferences on this with UNSCAP, the Chinese government hosted many of these conferences. This is long before Xi Jinping. And this particular politician and his wife, the politician himself didn't go, he couldn't go. His wife went and attended and spoke at this conferences. So the ideas of building a network of communication linking the entire Eurasian continent has many fathers. It is not the Chinese government. And then in 2010, the World Bank and the Chinese NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, which is their highest planning body, it's a cabinet level position in the State Council, they together worked and researched and published a book, China 2030. And they looked at how far China had come in building a market economy within its socialist political system. So state-centric political system, but fundamentally a market economy, which means private ownership of capital. Now, you need to really think about it. Some of you are economists and you'll know this. I'm not an economist, but I understand the hybrid system that the Chinese have built, which enables its leadership, its ruling elite, to look at plans 20, 30 years ahead and consistently pursue these plans and then build one particular leadership builds on the foundation led by others before them. The first person I see in the Chinese leadership who mentioned the Silk Road is a man named Li Peng, who was premier in the early 1990s. Remember that he's the man, it's called the Butcher of Beijing. He was Zhou Enlai's adopted son, and he became premier after Zhao Jiang was sent out of power. Then Li Peng became the premier. And in 1992, Li Peng went to Kazakhstan. He went to Central because the Soviet Union collapsed and you had what's called the Commonwealth of Independent States. The former Soviet republics formed what they called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Life was really very different then. And Li Peng went and said, China wishes to build relations with all our friendly neighbors. We have historical connections. We want to build commercial relations, nothing political. And if you wish, we visualize trade and commerce to build. And he said, we would build on the historical tradition of the Silk Road. And that's how the name Silk Road came into being. And then what you had, the World Tourism Organization, part of the United Nations, they began holding annual conferences on Silk Road tourism in Astana, in Ashgabat, the Central Asian republics. So the Silk Road took on a life of its own. And then with UNDP and UNESCAP, and then overall the World Bank and the UN organization together gradually built what you call a palimpsest. You put a layer of print, and then I put a layer on that. Somebody else adds to that. And that's how it grew until in 2013, Xi Jinping named it Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the terrestrial land route, mostly railway, but also roads and pipelines, and Maritime Silk Road going down. Now, the Maritime Silk Road had a strategic objectives. And this is important to point out. I mentioned 2004. This is a crucial year. In 2001, Imdad, shut me down if you think that I'm talking too much. But this is really important to understand this.
I guess I'm keeping an eye on what's going on. I think everybody's pretty absorbed at this stage of time.
Okay. So I just want to mention 2004. It's an important year because certain things that happened in 1999. The first thing was the Americans bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Of course, they said it's an accident. It was not intended. We had a wrong map. The CIA's maps were old and outdated. We did not know that the embassy had shifted to where the Ministry of Transport, et cetera, et cetera. This is not something the Chinese officially accepted. Ambassador Pickering carried out an investigation. And then, of course, compensation was paid and the embassy was rebuilt. But the distrust and the mistrust never went down. The other thing was in 1999, the United States Congress passed the NDAA, this is done every year, National Defense Authorization Act, is the defense budget. It's a very large budget, but what is interesting is that Congress added 4 conditions on the budget itself. The first was stop all communication with the PLA that the DOD, the Pentagon, the US Department of Defense had built up over the last 10, 15 years, very intense engagement with the PLA, with the Chinese military, because they wanted to build up the Chinese military against the Soviet Union. So they were transferring technology, they were doing a lot of training. Harvard University had set up a special course for senior colonels from the PLA. So a lot of engagement. And in 1999, the Congress said, stop this. No contact with the PLA. They are getting too much information from us and they'll use it against us. Second thing, the National Defense University, which is in Washington, DC, should set up a center for studying the PLA and its strategy and doctrine, its operations, its order of battle, and so on. Third thing is the Defense Intelligence Agency should start producing an annual report on China's military power and its military activities. Now, this is what the DIA used to do in the 1980s against the Soviet Union. So essentially what the Congress was saying, that we had the Soviet Union during the Cold War, now we have the PLA, and you have to go back to that hostile kind of approach. Monitor them. And fourthly, Congress set up a bipartisan commission. It's called the, I've got annual reports from. It's a bipartisan commission on commercial and security relationship, USCC, United States, China, Commerce and Security Relationship Commission. It's a bipartisan commission. It submits an annual report on US-China relationship for Congress, not the government, but the Congress. So all this decisions taken by Congress, which were then executed by the government, by the Clinton administration, showed to the Chinese and to the rest of the world that the USA is already treating China as some sort of a rival. The USA also began monitoring Chinese military movement along China's coast. And in 2001, on the 1st of April, there was a collision, you know, that a Chinese PLA pilot was killed. The American crew of an EP-3 electronic warfare aircraft, which had to forced to land on Hainan Island, and the 24-man crew was detained for 12 days. A major crisis for President George W. Bush. They resolved it, but the bitterness never went out. And in 2004, the US government issued what's called, they had been conducting a 2-year study, Global Posture Review, GPR. And the report specifically said that we shall, over a period of time, deploy 60% of our expeditionary forces, that is Air Force, Marines, and Navy in the Pacific. They did not say China is the main threat, but it was made very clear that is the objective. So in 2004, the USA began deploying 60% of its expeditionary forces around China. And the Chinese took notice. I mean, they're not idiots. They have a civilization going back some 3,000 years. Now, what Hu Jintao, who was the president and the chairman of the, what they call the Central Military Commission, did, for the first time, he issued orders, new missions for the new era to the PLA, People's Liberation Army. It was fundamentally altering the Navy's purpose. The Navy's purpose had been protect the coast because China's wealth, all its industry, its manufacturing business, its trade and commerce was in sort of Guangzhou, Shanghai, Dalian. So from Fujian province or Zhejiang province right up to Manchuria, but on the coast of South China Sea and East China Sea. The wealth, something like 70% of China's wealth was in the coastal belt. And this coastal belt had to be protected. So he said, the Chinese Navy not only must protect this coastal belt, which is where our wealth is, it must also protect the sea lanes, which ensured that we continue to survive economically and prosper. And the sea lanes pass through South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. So the Navy's role was then expanded from coastal defense to protecting the lines of communication.
This thing.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. Mahmud, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the second poll is coming. I'm launching it now. Please do answer. I expect answers from everybody so that we have a fair go. It's yes and no, select one. Here it goes. You have 15 seconds to answer this question, please. No answer. A few answers are coming through. There are a lot of other people who haven't answered this question. Come on. Come on, guys, everybody.
আপনার উচিত ছিল থার্ড অপশন রাখা।
হ্যাঁ, অনেক কিছু ছিল যদি অনেক কিছু করা সম্ভব
because এই পার্টিকুলার কোশ্চেনে থার্ড অপশনটা রিভিল করতে কিছুটা।
Yeah, Mahmud has already answered this question actually.
I have answered, yes.
Yeah, it's your opinion. It's your opinion.
I'm invested in this, man.
Yeah.
It's your opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've got a fair bit of it. It's almost even.
Well, they'll say Nathu Singh and Prem Singh won the same time.
Mahmud, I've got a question. I've got a statement for you. Are you there?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say
good morning
the Chinese, somehow other people are barging in without, can you please mute yourself? Mahmud, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Mahmud, this statement for you. Is it fair to say what we notice today is a spectacular economic development of China? There's no doubt about it. And the Horan report clearly states the amount of wealth they have accumulated over a very small span of time. Now, having said that, is it fair to say, while the Chinese have a market economy with a communist government or a centralized government, unchanged government, and as a result, capital doesn't overrule the politicians. Whereas in the Western world, particularly in US, we see that the politician, it also has a market economy, but the capitalists overtake the politicians, and as a result, the Chinese have a long-term policy which, because of no change in the political system, they can pursue and they can stick to it. Whereas in US, with the change, because the capitalists can overrule or overtake the politician, they change the policies to their liking. What I'm trying to say is, in China, they have a firm policy, but in states, the policies change with the change of government. Whereas in China, that doesn't happen. Am I fair to assess that in one go?
Imdad bhai, can I add one little thing?
Yes, please.
Actually, আমি জানি না if Mahmud bhai is looking at the chat room.
Mahmud, I'm sure you know Zahir.
Yes, I do know. Zahir, I'm delighted to see you, my friend.
Zahir, please introduce
you guys
yourself.
are economists. You know this much better than I do.
Mahmud bhai, no, I actually put up questions on the side, so I thought.
I can't see. I'm afraid I can't see your questions.
If you open the chat room. If you open the chat room, you'll see.
Never mind, please. Go ahead.
Imdad bhai, apnar sathe, if I can add, Imdad bhai's question deals with as if the sovereigns are there at the national state level. But if you go into the global level, then there can be a contesting hypothesis, which is people often mention that the Chinese on their own could not mature to this level and contest the US supremacy. It is suggested that a second kind of global capital emerged with its origin in the IT and ICT-based industry in Europe, which created this new power, which relied actually, hanging on to the US governance structure.
On the Imdad, may I answer?
Yes, please. If Zahir is finished.
Your question, Zahir, if I may first address what Imdad said, and I can now read your question. So thanks very much. These are fascinating issues. And first of all, I have to defer to you guys, both Imdad and Zahir. You guys are economists and I'm not. I look at sort of geopolitical and strategic aspects, but a bit of it is economics based because fundamental resource of a country is its economic strength. So to that extent, we try to relate that how much resources can produce how much power. The DPRK, for example, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, people laugh when they hear the name DPRK, but Marxists have a different interpretation of democracy. And the bourgeois liberal interpretation of democracy is quite different. Now, I come from the bourgeois liberal, all of us, I guess, come from that tradition because we have studied Western tracts, what politics and economics mean, which really means that capital controls politics or capital makes politics. So I'm reminded of this. Barack Obama once in his second election talked about this on the campaign. He said how sad it is that we have to spend $1 billion each to run in this election. Now, Barack Obama is a wealthy man. He's a professor and an author, makes millions, but $1 billion he doesn't have. So he had to sort of beg, borrow, steal, cajole. So every candidate who runs for president in the USA over the last 20 odd years have had to find $1 billion, roughly. Most of it goes for TV advertising. That's very expensive. Sort of 10-second slots cost a bomb. But you need $1 billion to be in the running meaningfully for president. And right down the line, sort of county sheriffs, you need a lot of money for running for. That's democracy in the liberal bourgeois or bourgeois liberal marketplace. Socialist states have a different view that capital must not be allowed, as you said, capital must not be allowed to control power. That power must, Henry Kissinger described this when he was briefing President Ford. I think in 1974, 75, Ford went to China for his first meeting with Chairman Mao. And before he went to America, Henry Kissinger, then Secretary of State, was briefing President Ford. And he was describing the Chinese leadership as a group of monks. These people are committed to developing their country because they have had a hell of a history for the past 100 years. The Chinese call it a century of humiliation. And if you look at the history of the 18th century, the last bit of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, it was terrible. There was no China as such. There were 20 different countries, 20 different armies fighting each other. There was no control. We talk about Sun Yat-sen, the Republic, and then Chiang Kai-shek. These people controlled very little. Maybe a city, maybe 10 cities, and that's it. China is a very large country with lots of people. And it is extremely difficult to unite this. And it is only the CPC, starting from about 1950, that they managed to get hold of the whole of what we call the People's Republic today together. Together with a single unified leadership, not, although there are divisions, there are factional feuds even now, but more or less united, holding it together and rising. Still very insecure domestically, but rising relatively fast, quite dramatically. So yes, they have not allowed, they have allowed the bourgeoisie and neo-bourgeoisie to rise. There are more billionaires now in China than in Western Europe, for example. But those billionaires are not sort of leaders of the Communist Party. They're members of Communist Party, most of them. But that most college or university students I've met in China are members of the Communist Party. It's a meritocratic organization, and it also gives you a leg up, gives you an advantage in moving up in your career. So why not? People do that not because they believe in Maoist or Marxist ideology, but it helps their career. But some are genuinely believers. They believe that feudalism must not be allowed to reappear, that money must not be allowed to take control of politics again. So you have all kinds, but China has definitely proved a lot of people wrong. In a presentation 6 months ago, I said China's biggest failure in the eyes of the West was its failure to fail. There was a lot of predictions in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that China is about to collapse, the party is going to break down, and they're going to fission, or they're going to become like Russia, they'll become democratic, it'll be different, they'll be like us. China will be nothing like anybody else. China will be like China. China has a continuous recorded history of more than 2,000 years and unrecorded history of a total history of about 5,000 years. You do not survive as a unified culture, a broadly unified culture, unless there is a fundamental consensus. Even then, I have to point out that there are dissidents. People are very upset with the system. They are fleeing the country. Money, capital is running away. So there'll always be opposition there. As far as Zahir's question, very interesting question that although Vietnam has become the most vocal of ASEAN member states critical of China, and the only ASEAN state to have actually fought a war with China, even though China, a very poor China in the 1950s, provided several $1 billion of economic and military aid to Vietnam, or to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam of Ho Chi Minh, to fight the French and then fight the Americans. But the Vietnamese then turned around and fought the Chinese instead. There is still party-to-party communication. And so at one level, Vietnam, the Vietnamese state is strongly opposed to China, particularly in the South China Sea. But I think party-to-party contacts remain quite robust. And the Vietnamese Workers' Party is a socialist party, as socialist as the Chinese Communist Party. So I should think that Vietnam suffers from some sort of a schizophrenia, if you like. It hates China, but it also likes China. And I was
Thank you, Mahmud. Next poll
Imdad
coming up,
bhai,
please.
Mahmud bhai, there was a first
Mahmud,
question.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Mahmud, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Ashfaq, Kochi.
Yes.
First question before the...
Can I speak for 30 seconds?
Oh, who's going to speak? Can I ask?
My name is Ashfaq. I was a platoon mate with Mahmud in the 47th PMA long course in Pakistan.
I got basketballer in Notre Dame.
I got it, Ashfaq. But how come you're Qazi?
Right. Yeah, my name is Qazi Ashfaq Ahmed. That's my name.
Okay. Would you like to turn your video on, please?
I can't do both at a time somehow. I will get back to it.
Okay.
Okay. My question is, we keep hearing about one word. It's called the trap. Now, there was a trap laid down by the IMF and the World Bank, and they used it in South America. Do you think the Chinese are doing the same thing?
Can I answer?
Please do.
Please.
Okay. About 18 months ago, we had a conference here in Malaysia, and we had guest speakers from many different countries, including the gentleman who was the chairman of the Colombo Port Trust Authority, which is interesting. Gentleman's name Salia. Salia is the man who negotiated the deal with the Chinese Exim Bank for the Hambantota port. And he spent about 45 minutes displaying a series of slides, the negotiating points, the funds, the rates of interest, and so on. So Hambantota port was to be financed because all the Western multilateral institutions had said no. World Bank had said no. Asian Development Bank had said no. They had applied to some other people as well. Everybody had said no. So then they went to Exim Bank because Exim Bank had already funded development and expansion of Colombo Port, which was already in works. So they said, can you please also do this? And this was the president's pet project. It was his dream. Why? Because that's his constituency. And Hambantota had been devastated by do you remember this, the Boxing Day tsunami on 26 December 2004?
Yeah. Yep.
And the president felt obliged. It's his constituency. It's dirt poor, very, very poor, badly damaged. He wanted to do something. And surveyors had shown that it had deep sea entrances. So he went to them and they said, okay, it'll be financially difficult in the sense that returns will take a very long time. But if you are willing to go with it, then Chinese Exim Bank said yes. So the first one, the two tranches of finance provided, the first tranche was $1.something billion, less than $1.5 billion. And the second one was big, $3.5 billion or so, if I recall correctly. This is Mr. Salia telling us all this. And he's the man who signed the agreement on behalf of the government of Sri Lanka. He's the chairman of the Sri Lanka Port Trust Authority. Now, the agreement with the Exim Bank was standard. The finance is to be done at the rate of LIBOR plus 0.01%. LIBOR is London Interbank Overnight Rate. This is the rate at
Offered rate.
Offer rate, yes. Sorry. Thank you. So it is the overnight. LIBOR is London-based exchange that banks charge to each other. So LIBOR is an internationally recognized rate between banks or among banks. LIBOR plus 0.1%. The 0.1% is the administration charge. And both the Chinese and the Sri Lankan signatories accepted this. So LIBOR initially was, at the time when they signed the first tranche, LIBOR was very low. It was 2.3 or something like that. Second time, when the phase 3 had to be built and funding had to be provided, the $3.5 billion, the formula was the same, LIBOR plus 0.1%. LIBOR had gone up to 5.5%. So obviously the interest rate on a bigger principal has to be much bigger. This is Mr. Salia's explanation. So if there was a trap, I don't think the Chinese laid it. It was a voluntary agreement between two sovereign entities, principals, and they agreed on this deal. Of course, the Sri Lankans found it very difficult because not many ships were coming in.
Mm-hmm.
There was not much enough revenue collected because in the meanwhile, Colombo port had expanded significantly with Chinese help, and it was attracting much more traffic. So Hambantota was not able to pay its own way. I have to say this though, Hambantota project is not just a port, it's a major urban renewal project. So there's an international stadium, the hotel, there's an airport and so on. Only one airline was flying, so that was losing money as well. So the big Hambantota project is a major city, not just a port is the heart of it, but there's an entire range of other installations. So the Indians then said, okay, we will buy your airport, and they did. So that was fine. Nobody else offered to buy or lease for 99 years the Hambantota International Airport, but the Indians did it, not for any commercial reasons, but nobody complained about that. So what I'm saying is, let's have some sort of uniform, consistent parameters and standards for judging. And if the Sri Lankan authorities say it was not a debt trap laid by the Chinese, then who am I to say it was? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mahmud. On that note, may I remind the audience and the participants here that in case you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will request one by one to put their cases to Mahmud. Mahmud will surely love to address that. On that note of the port, Mahmud, can you please, are you there, Mahmud?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay. On that note, normally, that large an amount for an infrastructure project, usually they're not commercial loans, but unfortunately, you're absolutely pinpointed that it was a commercial loan, and as a result, they had brought storm to themselves, actually. Anyway, the next question or the next speaker would be Titumi. Titumi, can you please introduce yourself and put your statements or questions to Mahmud, please?
Thank you, Imdad Bhai. I'm Rashid Titumir. I teach in the University of Dhaka. I teach economics, and I have written some papers on BRI. So I do not get the chance of really interacting with a doyen like Mahmud Bhai. So thank you for organizing this. I have a little bit of a statement, and I would really like to hear your response to that. Say, on a theoretical plane, China has, for right reasons, drawn unprecedented attention from academics to state officials to business actors. But the voluminous literature is either marred in assertive dogmatism or excessive apprehension, but unknowingly or unknowingly by xenophobes or xenophiles. So, on the contrary to the literature written from these liberal and realist lenses, there is a need to frame alternate framework based upon internal conditions and compulsion resulting from a particular political settlement of a given country that defines the external strategy of this particular country. So accordingly, the re-rise of China is a long-drawn political outcome. The Maoist era laid down the crucial foundation, and if we really look at even Deng Xiaoping's cautious international strategy of conceal brilliance and cultivate inner strength, to President Xi Jinping's dream for China's future, in which he hopes by 2049 that China will be in a position of global preeminence that it enjoyed in imperial times. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the political strategy helped devise the strategic, tactical, and operational processes. For example, Mao's 1962 war against India helped China gain more territory in Ladakh after it earlier took over the control of Aksai Chin region. Mao considered Tibet to be China's right-hand palm, with five fingers, Nepal, Bhutan, and the three Indian territories of Ladakh, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh. So the recent episode are to be understood in that line. So what I'm getting at it, that the Indo-China relationship has to be assumed to be that of a competitive cooperation between the two, where India's strategy could be described as 2 steps backward and 1 step forward, while China wants to herald herself as a superpower and contain India at best as a regional power. Secondly, Sino-USA relationship can be described as one of accommodation and hedging. So in case of Bangladesh, there are efforts to corner Sino-Bangladesh relationship to that of an economic one. The tactical change from that of careful indifference to the current active engagement is a part of a long-drawn political strategy. And history testifies that Chinese are interested in all-encompassing relationship with all political parties. For example, Sheikh Mujib visited China twice in 1952 and 1957 and wrote The New China as I Saw It, Amar Dekha Noya Chin. And Maulana Bhashani wrote another book titled Mao Zedong Er Deshe. Such continues as of today, and there are plenty of evidences. For example, the Chinese medical equipment container during COVID-19 contained the slogan, Bhalobasha Nouka Pahar Baiya Chole. Anyone familiar with China knows that the slogan originates from the well-known Chinese fable, the foolish old man removes the mountains, which were repeatedly used in Chinese CPC literature. So the point that I was trying to make, it's the political compulsion that has a long drawn process, and that's really defining it. So the hardest task in delving into contours of policy choices for the so-called small and relatively weak countries with competing powerful neighbors. Nonetheless, the balancing mechanism in South Asia comes out of the absence of considered political strategies, as evident from the misadventures stemming from the tendencies of reincarnation of that of a British Raj and lack of consolidated whole of society comprehension of what constitute the idea of India. This fortifies an absence of normative legitimacy and social approval amongst the people, making them hungry for a delicate balance. So I just took the time to hear your thoughts on that. So it's not China is coming, re-rise is of just moment or an event. It's a long drawn political strategy. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Titumir. Mahmud, would you like to respond, please?
I'm very happy to sort of
your
hear
comments.
What Dr. Titumir has to say. I'm very happy. It's a learning point for me. You'll have to give me time to sort of digest what he said. And I think broadly, I would agree that there are historical processes which define every single moment that we slice. We see what's happening now from the newspaper headlines, but there are processes that have gone on for decades, maybe occasionally centuries, and the Chinese always go back to their history for defining their present. So yes, broadly, yes, but I need time for digesting what you have said.
Lovely, understand. Thank you, Mahmud. I'm sure in due course it would be addressed to the liking of Titumir and we all. Moshir would be next.
Shafiq has an extended comment about Kishore Mahbubani.
Yeah, but just give me a moment. Because
could I ask that question?
Shafiq, give me a moment, please. I have a quiz for the House. Again, another 15 seconds for you to answer. This is an interesting one. Fifteen seconds, please. That's an interesting one. I guess we all had seen that. Now, Shafiq, may I ask you to be next Meanwhile, Monsieur, if you can please ask your question. Monsieur.
Before I forget, Ititumir, you said something about Bhalobasha Nauka Chinese slogan. What is that? I could catch it. What is that? Can you repeat?
Je Bhalobasha Nauka Pahar Baiya Chole, and this originates from the long drawn Chinese fable that the old foolish man removes the mountain, and this has been oftly repeated by Mao Zedong in different party forum as well as until very recently.
Okay.
Moshe, are you ready to answer ask Mahmoud your question?
Yes. So,
Moshe, can you please turn on your video?
I have some problem with the video, I think. So, I'll try.
We can't get to see you.
I'll try, but let me keep asking and then I'll try.
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
So basically, I think the question on that PRI that Imdad and Abhijit also asked in terms of the initiative, right? China's Belt and the Road Vision, and the book that Mahmud Bhai have written on that geoeconomics and geopolitics. And I read, I had that copy, electronic copy, and I didn't read everything, but there are 7 chapters. I did first one and last one, okay, and middle, just skim through. So my question is that while I was reading the last chapter, and you concluded that, sort of that it is impossible to predict BRI's final outcome before all its planned projects are operational, but the evidence presented in your book suggests much anxiety informing Western analysis is rooted in the fear of unknown about Chinese growth. So my question is that, I don't know, the book was written maybe 3 years ago or so. And then I think people, in the world watching and maybe your contents, but my question to you today, right? Today, if we ask where it stands in terms of impact, in geoeconomics and geopolitics in Asia, Europe, and of course in America. And I have second question, but if you can answer, then I'll have a small question, the last one.
Moshe, we would love to see your face.
Well, let me see.
Yes, Mahmoud, please go, if you can address
Okay, as far as the book is concerned, the conclusion, if you have noticed, that there is enormous fear, not just anxiety. Anxiety, of course, I call it displacement anxiety, because we have had roughly 500 years, start from the end of the sort of 15th century when the European era of exploration began. And Europeans from small countries, Spain, Portugal, and so on, they went out outside of Europe and they took possession of territories that they discovered. The New World, sort of Western Hemisphere, North and South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, wherever the Europeans went, they decided that they could claim this particular land in the name of their king or queen, the emperor, the sovereign. And they did that, ignoring entirely the views of the local natives. So this happened to China as well, but much lesser extent, only in the coastal belt. But nonetheless, the sense of the Chinese, not so much the common people, because I don't think their views are very well known, but certainly the elite, the mandarins around the court and the emperors and the extended princely families, they all felt the pressure from the West and also from Japan. And the Belt and Road, I think, is offering, in many ways, a new model, which does not control other people's territory. But I think it extends China's ability to shape decisions positively for China by using financial, technological, political, economic influence. So China is giving something and seeking something in return. It is not like, say, for example, in our case, in India, the subcontinent, when India became part of the British Empire, it was Indian revenue which provided salaries for the British armed forces and the British civil servants as well as for the board of control that controlled the British East India Company in London. So colonies provided resources for their colonization. China, I think, is suggesting that there are more reciprocal ways of engaging in economic interactions and exchanges. So the Belt and Road is not just about infrastructure or protecting your sea lanes of communication, but also about offering a different model. So if you look at I think chapters 2 would provide some indication of what the Chinese thinking has been. And the second question I haven't heard. Did you ask the second question?
No, I didn't.
Would you like to put forward your question, please?
The second question is, I mean, I know you have studied a lot of papers and all these things. So while you were writing this book, you know, any kind of research paper.
We can't hear you. Monsieur, you must come near the speaker, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the second question, Mahmud Bhai, is that, I mean, when you're writing this kind of article or book, right, and you have to read a lot of, materials, research papers, all these things. And I was wondering, in your conclusion or, in your kind of suggestion, are you using any kind of, model? Because, I mean, I know like a country like Israel or in any other advanced countries, they try to simulate situation, right? They can predict what is going to happen in 10 or 15 years. So in your research, are you using that kind of parameters to or any specific model in a strategy kind of model or anything in your thinking?
No,
thank you, Moshe.
Well, thanks very much. No, I do not choose sort of quantitative work. This is just a qualitative assessment of what is available in the public domain. There's a lot of documentation which shows 3 sets of responses to the initiative. The first is, of course, the proposition as it is offered by the Chinese, the NDRC, which is the National Development and Reform Commission. The second one is the United States and its allies, which are very strongly opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative. They have their own particular perspective, which is very different from the Chinese one. And the third is those countries, something like 65, and now slightly more, maybe 104 now, but 65 countries which originally signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017, their views. So 3 sets of different views, 3 sets of different action, 3 sets of different interest. I think the variable numbers are so large and the future is indeterminate. There's a phrase in English called the future is unknowable. We cannot know. We can predict, but these are actually judgment calls. On the basis of the information I have today, I project forward and then I make a prediction. I'm not in the business of making predictions. I'm in the business of telling the facts that I have to hand. Now, gathering the facts is really crucial because what I see around me is a lot of passion, lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of subjectivity. And I try to sort of understand what the facts are. And that's a challenge. That's a pretty big challenge now. But coming as I do from the European School of Social Scientific Research, facts speak louder than passion. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahmud. Thank you for addressing Moshu's statement. May I now request, who was that?
Shafiq?
Shafiq, would you like to ask a question? I'll come back in rotation. If you do, please go ahead now.
Yeah. There is a new book by the well-known former diplomat of Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani. The title of the book is Has China Won? And I think he has also published a book called Has the West Lost? Now here he posits that China is developing itself based on its own civilization that dates back thousands of years. So he basically considers this development to be reasonably benign. On the other hand, the Chinese civilization also requires obedience to the central authority. So unlike in the West, where multiple views are not only tolerated, but encouraged, for China, are we looking at a very powerful country that has support from its own population in subjugating its neighbors?
I think you're absolutely right that China historically has thrived when a central authority managed to bring the whole country together. China has had a sequence of empires being built, rising, becoming powerful, expanding, and then overextending itself, becoming weak and fragmented, lots of divisions, lot of internal fighting and feuding, and then one kingdom rises to reunify. So there's a whole cycle of dynastic feuds sort of coming together and fragmenting. Whenever they have managed to come together, like the Southern Song or the Tang dynasty, particularly the Ming as well, more recently, they managed to do very well. And there is this view that a stable China is better than an unstable and fragmented China. So that element of a strong, centralized, authoritarian, if you like, imperial China, is something that I think we have to live with. The question is whether that domestic consensus on unified, centralized dispensation, whether that will be translated outside its border. This is the Western fear, is that a centralized authoritarian China would export its model to the third world and then to everywhere else. I somehow do not see evidence of this, and I'll explain why I say that. Because China remains extremely insecure and defensive. It is a schizophrenic polity in the sense that the leadership is obliged to provide confidence to its population. It has had very recently 100 years of foreign subjugation, really bitter and brutal subjugation. And it will never, ever allow that to happen again. This is the promise given to the Chinese people by the CPC. And there is enough evidence that the CPC uses history or China's recent history of imperial colonization and subjugation as an instrument of building legitimacy. But it is also a fact, Shafiq, that I'm sure many of our colleagues here know this, that from the early 1990s, when the Harvard University opened a special course for, particularly for PLA, People's Liberation Army officers, Harvard also began conducting annual surveys. And statistical data, statisticians know, have a particular way of ensuring that the country's population is represented in the opinion. And this has been done every year since the 1990s until I think the last was in 2017. And the one consistent result of the Harvard opinion poll China study was that between 85 and 95% of the people who registered their opinion were either happy or very happy with the services they received from the government. There were serious complaints about local government and local officials, but as far as Beijing is concerned, they were either happy or very happy, and that's between 85 and 95%. And I think Joseph Biden would give his arm and a leg for that sort of poll numbers. So yes, authoritarian, but is it serving the perceived needs of the population? I'd say yes. Yes, it is. But whether it'll try to occupy that, I don't think China has solved all its domestic problems to really start aggressive movements. I don't think so. It has ancient claims, historical claims, claims that were apparently accepted at Cairo, at Potsdam, at Yalta, all these conferences during and immediately after the Second World War. And the Chinese keep on saying, guys, the conferences which we attended or the Chinese representative attended, you assured us that whatever the Japanese had taken from us or the Germans had taken from us will be returned to China. And now how can you say that that's illegal? So there is a lot of stuff in there to dig around. I don't think China is fundamentally an aggressive country. It went to war twice, once in 1962 and once in 1979. It fought for exactly 30 days, and then it went back to the line which it had occupied before crossing that line. So once with Vietnam in 1979 and once with India in 1962. But it went back voluntarily after 30 days. These are, I think, the Chinese recognize that warfare is not going to sort of do much benefit to it. And now things are very dangerous. The world, or a large portion of the world, is against it now. So I don't think military aggression makes any sense for them, but defense, yes, they will defend themselves. And they've made that very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahmud. That was wonderful. Shafkat, would you be ready with your, I would urge whoever asks the question, please make it as short as possible.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Imdad. This is Shafkat Anwar. I'm Deputy Secretary of Ahli United Bank in Bahrain and keenly interested in geopolitical issues. To Mr. Mahmud Ali, my question is, there is a recent development which is pretty significant, it seems. It has been reported in the international press that China is signing a deal with Iran, which is a trade, defense, and cultural deal for 25 years. And included in this deal is a $400 billion investment in various infrastructure and developmental areas. And this has got a direct relevance with the US withdrawal of the China's nuclear deal in 2018. So are you aware of this, and what are your views?
Yes, thanks for your question. I have read press reports. I'm not privy to internal sort of official level discussions. I know from the press reports that the agreement is approaching sort of finalization, but it's a very detailed and very complex deal because the United States is trying very, very hard to reimpose sanctions which were lifted when the 2015 JCPOA, so that is Joint Common Program, that nuclear deal was signed and implemented. At that time, UN lifted the sanctions that had been imposed earlier. So the USA is trying very hard now to reimpose those sanctions. But I think, as you know, in the Security Council discussions, all the parties, except for one, I forget which one, except for one, all the parties voted against or abstained.
Dominican Republic.
Right. So Dominican Republic went with the USA, but nobody else did. It's a bit much for the United States to, first of all, withdraw itself voluntarily from the agreement, but then determine that everybody should support it in kicking back the sanctions which it had signed on to, the withdrawal of. So Iran obviously seeks a way out. It has enormous economic problem, as you know. It has been under sanctions for many, many years. Its economy is in terrible state. So is its politics. China is trying very hard through the BRI, the MSR and the SREB, very hard to bypass the Malacca dilemma. So there are ports in Myanmar, and of course, if you remember the Booz Allen Hamilton report that said that Chittagong would be one of those Chinese pearls in the Indian Ocean. The other would be Hambantota, third, or Colombo at that time, they're saying about Pakistan as well. China requires alternative sources to pump its energy and export trade, enable it to bypass Malacca Strait, because Malacca Strait is very well guarded by the Quad countries, as you know, and even countries that are not members of the Quad, and they can interdict. In fact, there have been papers written by US Air Force that I've read how to use land-based bombers, not bring aircraft carriers to stop Chinese shipping goods, oil and petroleum, either upwards to through north to China or back out into the Indian Ocean. So there are actually very well-prepared plans to stop Chinese shipping through the Malacca and Lombok Straits. And if those straits are actually interdicted or blockaded, then China's something like 90% of its shipping is actually maritime shipping. The rest is land, only 10%. And of the 90%, about 65% goes to the Indian Ocean. So therefore, its economic jugular is under the control of the US-led alliance in the Malacca-Lombok area. So China has to protect its energy supplies. And that's why the Iran deal, the Parsfield oil development project, and the Chabahar port, which India is no longer working on. All those things are really important for China's long-term economic health, the security of its energy supply. I can understand that. What I also can understand, the Western anxiety that a strong, powerful China providing a different model. Professor Kyron Skinner, whom I quoted at the beginning of a presentation, made very clear that it's not a Caucasian country. It's a very different culture, very different civilization, very different ideology. It does not accept American leadership. America had tried to, in fact, in 2009, November, when President Barack Obama for the first time visited Beijing, his team offered a G2 formulation to the Chinese. A G2 had been proposed by, speaking of Brzezinski. Brzezinski was President Carter's national security advisor as a senior Democratic leader. Now, he had written that US and China should form a consensus so that they can work together and protect the world, share their responsibilities, but also share their rights. And the Chinese said no. They said no G2 with anyone. We will not have any alliance against third parties. We'll work on our own. And the Americans were really upset about that. So rejection of American leadership, even in a position of subordinate sort of junior partner to the USA, China rejected that. So since then, the United States has been really concerned about China's growing power. So
thank you. Thank you, Mahmoud.
Good for Iran and good for China.
Thank you. Excellent. Now, could I ask Naseem Dar to please present his statement or question to Mahmoud?
Yeah, Mahmoud, here's a question, rather, here's a scenario. There are two blocs in the world. One is Russia and China, and the other is American and Europeans. Which Asian countries are going to join these blocs?
It's a good one. I wish I knew the answer to that. I think increasingly, there is skepticism because of President Trump's foreign policy. If President Trump is re-elected, the number of countries that become somewhat, I shouldn't say suspicious, but somewhat concerned about the United States becoming very increasingly narcissistic, focused on itself and its interests, not being a global leader as it used to be since sort of, if you like, since the 1990s and thereafter. That skepticism, I think, will increase. Europe, I have no doubts at all. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So all those countries we know will be. All NATO countries are with the United States. In fact, NATO and the European Union have made it very clear that they see China as a strategic or a systemic rival, and they've used that phrase. But other countries who are benefiting from their economic relationship with China, although they do not wish, for example, I live in Malaysia now, and in Malaysia, I remember last year, only last year, at the end of May, beginning of June, there is this annual Shangri-La dialogue of defense ministers in Singapore. And the Malaysian defense minister said this in answer to a question. He said, we in Malaysia love the United States, but we also love China. So that's the kind of ambivalence, or if you like, strategic schizophrenia that most countries suffer from. They need both of them. They don't want to take sides. They've seen what happens when you take sides. You get involved in other people's war. There was a war in Vietnam and everybody was affected in Southeast Asia. It went on for years and years and years. Began in the late 1940s with the French, and it did not end till the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese war. And then it calmed down. Everybody suffered. They don't want that. They wish to have a calm and peaceful life, which is not likely to happen, of course, But we hope that once the Trump administration comes to its logical end, whenever that happens, November or 4 years from now, the next succeeding government in the United States will find a way of engagement with China and establish some sort of a new equilibrium.
Thank you, Mahmud. That was excellent. That was, I'm sure we all get enlightened with your vision and your explanation and your thoughts on that. Before we proceed further, I have another polls for you. If you can please attempt and answer this, again, 15 seconds. 15 seconds for you all. Still to answer, please. Yeah, there we go. Lovely. Waiting. Waiting. Come on. Lot to go.
Answer is no.
Is that all? Okay.
Sure, you want us to follow your answer?
Yes, Firoz.
I said impossible.
Yes.
Thank you all for answering the question with that poll question. Can I ask Mahmud to ask his question, please, by unmuting himself first?
Yeah. Mahmud Bhai, this is Mahmud Hassan, 18 Take again from Dallas, Texas. So my second question is that I understand that Bangladesh and countries like that, they suffer from schizophrenia, but China doesn't. So if you were China, what would serve your best interest in Bangladesh, and how would you approach Bangladesh? And is it even a very important country for a country like Bangladesh? For a country like China, is Bangladesh that important?
Lovely. Very relevant question.
Well, thank you. Obviously, Mahmoud, I really cannot pretend to have any indication of what the Standing Committee of the Party Political Bureau, the highest decision-making group of 7 men, are thinking about Bangladesh. But I can just narrate. This is an anecdotal answer to your question. It is not a direct answer to your question, but it will give an indication of what the Chinese think about Bangladesh. Is the first engagement I have had with their government. They have a ministry called Ministry of State Security. In the West, this is known as their External Intelligence Service. But actually, they also have a lot of research and analytical activities. And they have a think tank, very extensive think tank, which advises their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's called SICR, China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. It's in Beijing. So I went to see them some years ago now. And I met one of the directors. He was a senior director, and I'd known him for some years. So I spoke to him about India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And I will not talk about what he said about India or Sri Lanka or Pakistan, since your question is about Bangladesh. This was October 2010. So place yourself back where Bangladesh was in October 2010. And this is, remember that Prime Minister Hasina had gone to Beijing in March 2010, and she had asked Wen Jiabao, our counterpart, to present 2 frigates with helicopters. She was very specific. Frigates with helicopters to the Bangladesh Navy. It is very unusual for the head of a government to go to another head of a government and request, quite frankly, no correspondence, no memorandum of understanding, just openly that please, we'd like you very much to present 2 frigates with helicopters to the Bangladesh Navy. And she did. She did that because although it was unusual in terms of diplomatic practice, but she felt comfortable and confident. And then next year, when she spoke about it in Dhaka, in Khulna actually, she said, and the Chinese government agreed. So she went to Beijing in March of 2010, and I went to this director person in October 2010. And I said, okay, so what are your views on China's relationship with Bangladesh? And he was very cryptic. He said, look, he smiled and he said, the government of China is very happy and satisfied with its relationship with the government of Bangladesh. They're happy. They were happy in October 2010 and they're happy today, yeah. I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahmud. Mahmud, on that note, I understand that Singapore has two sets of agreement, one with the US and one with China. Now they have a wonderful balancing act. Now, given, I'm referring to it, the simple reason is Bangladesh today, I'm sure the whole house would agree, has to play around and maneuver its diplomacy as much as it can. Because on one hand, we have this legacy of India being a big neighbor. And on the other hand, China, with its resources that they can dish out to Bangladesh. So we are looking at China for, like you mentioned earlier, for their help in finances, whereas we can't just ignore India today. And if we do look only towards the resource, ignoring India, that's fine. But on the other hand, not to forget that our single largest country which imports our goods, are US. Again, given the trade relationship today and the retaliation in trade and so on and so forth, we can't again be completely aligned with China. So where do we stand actually? Or can we have a similar agreement in due course at all, so that we can for a while sojourn ourselves in a little comfortable zone? I'd like to have your response before we proceed further.
I think this is the fundamental question for Bangladesh, I think. How do you place your foreign policy direction when you are placed in such a geopolitical backdrop that you have this very powerful, large country right next door, and then you have an equally powerful and large country some distance away, and you need help from both of them. So I go back to last year, I think November, just before the election. Prime Minister Hasina invited a group of Indian journalists to Gana Bhavan, to her official residence. And that, what she said to the Indian journalists is really interesting as an insight. She said, for us, development is the most important issue because our people benefit from development. Wherever we can get help, we will get it. India should not worry about it. She felt it necessary to reassure India that in Bangladesh needed development assistance, and at the moment, China was the country that was willing to offer large volumes of technical, financial support and infrastructure building and so on. And she was going to get it because Bangladesh's people, 164 million people, need that. And India should not worry because India perhaps sees Bangladesh's relationship with China in a zero-sum geopolitical and strategic sense. Bangladesh's interests are far more economic, if you like, just selfish. So striking a balance is a tricky one. Singapore, incidentally, has this. It offers base facilities at Changi to the Americans. Singapore also has been exercising its army with the Taiwanese, but Singapore was the first country in the world to provide financial and technological support after Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore in 1978 and in fact built a city, Suzhou. They built that city, Singapore, China city. So Singapore is invested in China. And if you listen to Lee Hsien Loong, the prime minister, who's been speaking now for about 2 years, until 2 years ago, he was quite strongly pro-West because his military was part of the Quad tacitly. But now he's saying that both countries have to find a new equilibrium, because you've just got to live with each other. You can't go to war. We will not support war. We cannot afford another war between the US and China. It is unrealistic, impractical, utterly destructive. And we can't afford it. We must stop such conflict. We must come to an accommodation with each other. So that's the Singaporean line. I'll stop there.
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful explanation. Now we have Nazrul. Nazrul, if you can please put your question to Mahmud.
Yeah, this is Nazrul from 4th Intake, Houston. Thank you, Mahmud Bhai. Thoroughly enjoying this discussion. The question, Bangladesh has got a lot of infrastructure projects that some of them are ongoing and some are in planning stages, right? At least one project that we all know about, Padma Bridge project, they're financing it from their own money, from our own money, right? So would you actually recommend utilizing our reserves that I think currently sits at $34 billion or thereabout to actually for infrastructure projects as much as we can, rather than actually relying on loans from India or China or anybody else for our own benefit? What is their recommended strategy regarding that?
Well, I'm neither an engineer nor an economist, Nazrul, as you know. But I remember in the 1990s, I had one opportunity to talk to the governor of Bangladesh Bank. And we had this discussion of why Bangladesh had capital control of such severe nature. And one thing he said is that Bangladesh required serious capital control because its reserves are only $2 billion. So Bangladesh has come quite a long way. But $34 billion may sound a lot, but you have a country of a population of 168 million. And I think $34 billion would probably be what, 3-4 months import cover. You need to have at least 6 to 8 months import cover to play with your savings or your reserves. Bangladesh also has serious current account deficits. So there are lots of liabilities. And I think if you look at the financial system within Bangladesh now, I know nothing about banking, but I can tell you that Bangladesh's banks are surviving on oxygen, particularly the state banks or the state-controlled banks. So there is a lot of liability. And the question is, how safe do you feel to play with the reserves that you have? I'd rather that Bangladesh did not borrow any money at all, because money is not just capital, it's also capital plus interest, which means you are making your next generation pay for your follies. And also, if you look at what they call leakage, is it 10%? Is it 15%? The loans that you take come on the shoulder of the countries, but you lose a lot of it. So the less loan you take, the better off you are. But are you able to actually ensure enough funds to cover your imports for the next 6 to 8 months and then use your reserves for infrastructure? Not yet. I think Bangladesh would be sensible to go above 50 billion. And then 50 billion is a reasonable sum of money. But also remember, the reserve doesn't stay in Bangladesh. It goes to the Federal Reserve in New York. And from there, some North Korean or Sri Lankan would take $1 billion. They almost did. We can laugh, my friend, but this almost happened. Mm-hmm. I think we lost about, what, 200 million in the end?
No, 80,
and the rest
80.
of it was recovered. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, thank you. Now, before we proceed further, my last question to you, or rather my last polling question. If you can please answer this. ASAP.
It would take the least.
It's a no-brainer.
It's almost, there are a lot many people to answer.
Very easy question.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, look, we have been here for more than 2 hours now, and I believe I need to wind it up, as we have already taxed Mahmud. I have two questions before I can shut it down. Number one, precisely, yes, no, or within a sentence, within a frame of sentence. Do you think the dominance of US dollar is going to wane with time? Number one question. That's for you, Mahmud, please.
Sorry, US dollar is what I heard. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Okay. Do you think with passage of time, the US dollar is going to lose its value to Chinese yen?
I have recently read commentaries about the digital renminbi or digital yuan. And once the digital yuan takes off, if it does, remember that between Russia and China, there is a significant bilateral trade. And this year, for the first time, less than 50% of that trade was transacted in the US dollar. It was done by local currency. So that's one trend. The second one is the digital yuan. It has not become anything big yet, but I think the effort is to not to denigrate the dollar, but to liberate China from the constraints of its restrictions imposed by the United States, so that China can circumvent the sanctions that's being imposed by the United States. So yes, at some stage there'll be erosion, and if Donald Trump wins the election, then I suspect it will be speeded up.
Thank you, Mahmud. I believe we should, yeah, we have been here for 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we should call it a night. As far as I'm concerned, it is 2:15. Thank you, everybody, once again. Thank you, Mahmud, for bearing with the crowd, and I'm sure everybody is thrilled. However, you may please open up and thank Mahmud as you wish in the next 1 minute, because I
thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Mahmud Bhai.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thanks, Imdad, really. Thanks, Imdad, because it's already very late.
It was excellent.
Thank you.
Nice seeing everyone. Mahmud Bhai, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, and thank you so much, guys.
Thank you all.
Good to meet up again.
The whole house joins me in thanking you, including our good friend Mahmud, who has just taken off his his mask. Thank you all.
Yes, I can see that.
Good night, good day, good afternoon.
Thank you, Imdad Bhai. Thank you, Mahmud Bhai. Thank you.
Shams 81014. Thank you.